All right, guys. Welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. It's a beautiful Saturday morning here in California, and I'm going to start going over my behavior boot camp part one, basics of behavior. I am Dr. Amber Bousset, and I also hold my BCBA, which is my board certified behavior analyst degree. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about kind of all of the different components of behavior analysis and give you just an overview of that. So hopefully you can take it into your world and utilize it as well. Okay. All right, so what is behavior analysis? Behavior analysis really is just the involvement of two components, and that is the environmental events and behavior. And we're going to get into each of those as we move forward. But really, behavior analysis is the study of the relationship of those two things. So we're looking at how is behavior impacted by what's happening in the environment. And so applied behavior analysis, or otherwise known as ABA, which I'm sure you have all heard, is commonly used as a terminology. There's a term, in today's world. And that is really just the application of this piece of behavior analysis in the everyday world. So it's taking those two components and looking at how can we manipulate what's going on in the environment to change behavior in a positive way or in not a positive way. And that will get more explained throughout our session today. But that's really just kind of the gist of what behavior analysis is looking at the environment and how it's impacting behavior and how behavior is impacting the environment. So let's talk a little bit more about what are environmental events. And I really want to talk about the difference between the environment and environmental events, because those are technically two different things. So first off, environmental events are any physical event within the environment that can affect behavior. And I say that can affect because it doesn't necessarily have to affect that. So when I talk about the environment, I'm talking about an area that a person is in. So home, school, the playground, the lunchroom, those are all environments, right? So their particular bedroom could be a separate environment. Now, the difference between environment and environmental events are the environmental events are things within the environment that can impact that behavior from either happening or not happening. So a good example is the room temperature. If you've ever been really, really hot and it affects your mood, that is an environmental event. If a staff member is absent, or if you're in the work field, you have a coworker that's not there and it's impacting what you're able to do that day. Flickering lights, those are probably one of the things that is one of my biggest pet peeves. Whenever lights are flickering, I get really, really frustrated. And we'll talk a little bit more about that why. But it's really looking at what's in the environment and how can it affect me. And then another example that is quite common for a lot of kiddos that I've worked with in the past is that their shoes are either too tight or too loose. And that is an environmental event because it's not their actual human behavior. It's something that's on them. Their shoes are too tight, they're too loose, they don't like shoes, they want shoes off. So really looking at this as what's in the environment as one. So what is the environment? Is it home, school, playground? And what's happening in that environment? Is it too hot outside? Is it too cold outside? Is there something going on? There's a loud noise from the AC being on. All of those things can play a role, and that's the environmental event piece of it. So really, why do we need to even care about what's going on in the environment? It goes into what we call our three-term contingency. And this is really what is called the antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And we'll get into each one of these in a little bit more detail. But really, this is in the world of behavior. We talk about the three-term contingency. There is another term that's called the four-term contingency, but that's really going into a lot more specifics around it. And so really for basics and for understanding kind of what you need to know just as a start, this is what I want you guys to remember. And I'm sure you've heard it, ABC. They're collecting ABC data. That's antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And like I said, we're really going to get into each one of these in a lot more detail. Okay, so let's talk about what an antecedent is. So an antecedent is an event or thing that occurs directly prior to the behavior. And I say directly prior because it can't be something that happened 4 hours ago. we'll talk about kind of the differences and what that looks like, and what that term is. But an antecedent has to happen directly before the behavior. So a direction is given to a student to do a math worksheet. That is the antecedent. A direction was given. Something is taken away from the student, or he or she is told to transition to the next activity. All of those are the antecedents of what happens directly before the behavior occurs. So now we're going to go into what is actually the behavior. So looking at what is behavior, it's really anything that an organism can do. It must be observable, measurable, and something that can only be done by a living organism. And the reason that I say a living organism is because in behavior world, we use the question, can it pass the dead man's test? If a dead man can do it, then it's not considered behavior. So a dead man can be non-compliant. He won't answer your questions. He's dead. So we need to look at, when we're talking about specifically, say, non-compliance of something that a dead man can do, how can we define it so that it's able to be measurable and observable by other people? So some examples of behavior, let's just think about it. Brushing your teeth, sitting in a chair. And this is one that's interesting because a lot of people are like, well, a dead man can sit there. But the dead man can't do it by himself. He needs someone to put him in the chair. And so that's how that's a little piece of difference that you have to think about. If someone has to help the dead man to do it, then it's considered a behavior. So let's think of some other examples. Typing on a computer. I'm sitting at a computer right now. And so typing is considered a behavior. Talking is considered a behavior. And that is a huge thing in the behavior world. If you know anything about B.F. Skinner, who is the primary founder of behaviorism, or behavior analysis, he has a whole separate topic on verbal behavior and all of that. And I won't go into it, but it definitely is interesting. And if you have any more information, maybe that's something that we can talk about in another training or another video. So really, we just need to ask ourselves, can it pass the dead man's test? And if a dead man can do it, then it's not considered behavior. So that's a really good way of thinking about what is behavior and what is not. So, is it behavior? Yes or no? Singing? Yeah. A dead man can't sing. So at least I would hope not. He's dead. Saying no? Saying no is a behavior. You can verbally say no. Again, we talked kind of a little bit about non-compliance. Non-compliance, if it's defined well and is able to be observed by other people and is measurable, so you can count how many times someone is saying no, as if that's under the definition, and we'll get into that in a little bit, then it is, you can label it as non-compliance, but the behaviors that are labeled under that is what is actually the behavior versus the label of non-compliance. And that'll make more sense once we get into how to define behaviors. Sleeping, this is one that I get a lot. A dead man can sleep. He's always sleeping. He's dead. But technically, he's dead. He's not sleeping. So the behavior of sleeping is something that a human or another organism can and can't do, right? A dog can sleep. A dog can wake up. A dead man can't wake up. So those are ways to think about it. We kind of talked about sitting in a chair as well already. You have to be placed there in order for it to be for the dead man to be able to sit in the chair. So sitting in a chair is considered a behavior because you can go from standing to sitting. And it's something that you can observe and something that you can see that there's a difference of what the student or person is doing when they're engaging in that behavior. And then laying on the ground is very similar to that. A dead man can lay on the ground, but he has to be put there because unless he died on the ground, that's the only place that he would be laying on the ground. And so we want to make sure that, again, if it's something that another person has to do to the dead man, it's not considered it would be considered a behavior. And if you guys have any in the chat of questions about what are behaviors, what are not behaviors, please, please, please definitely throw them in there. I'd love to have a conversation back and forth, or you can always reach out and we can have a discussion. So now I really want to talk about what are the differences between behavior and inappropriate behavior. And I think this is really something that is a hot topic right now, especially I work as an advocate, and a lot of families are reaching out to me because discipline is happening at school around these inappropriate behaviors. And they're saying, yeah, it's part of my kid's disability. Why are they getting this particular discipline? And so that's going to be kind of what we're going to talk about next week about around that discipline measure and what the actual laws are around that in California. But really, again, we're talking about behavior is anything that an organism does. And kind of like a subcategory of the behavior is those inappropriate behaviors. And I think the biggest distinction are these 4 bullet points is that if it's an inappropriate behavior, it's a behavior that disrupts the learning of the person or other people. It interrupts with the skills the child already knows. So what I mean by this is, let's say they are able to complete their morning routine. They've mastered that. They're able to get up, brush their teeth, make their bed, get dressed. But all of a sudden now there's a tantrum in the middle of that. That's why it's an inappropriate behavior, because it interrupts with those skills that they've already previously mastered. And so we want to make sure that if they've already had those in their repertoire, that they're able to continue with those without having this inappropriate behavior. Obviously, if it's disruptive to family or the community, that could include, crying, tantruming outside in the community when maybe they don't get a cookie that they want or something that they want in that moment. And then if they're harmful to self or others, and I definitely want to stress that this is really the safety piece that a lot of families have been reaching out to me for. If they are hitting, kicking, even some property destruction, some families are very worried about the harm that they could be causing to themselves or to others. And so I really think that that is something to just kind of keep in the back of your mind, that we need to look at this is considered an inappropriate behavior, and why we call it either inappropriate, maladaptive. There's a ton of different ways that it's stated out there. Is that we want to definitely try to move forward and change this behavior so that we can still meet that need, but have it in a more socially appropriate way. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. So like I said, inappropriate behaviors are occurring to meet a need that the student is having. And I'm a big believer in behavior, no matter what it is, inappropriate or appropriate, is communication. They are trying to tell you something. They are trying to get something. They are trying to access something that they are unable to access without using their words. And so really we need to look at these inappropriate behaviors as what is the need that they're trying to get? What are they trying to communicate to us? And why are they doing that? What is it meeting in order to access to what are they trying to get? And then what we can do from there is leading what we call to replacement behaviors. So we can try to meet that same need. We can try to meet them where they're at, or teach them that communication to get that need met, in order to access it in a more socially appropriate way. And this helps to decrease the inappropriate behavior. So really when we're looking at, and I'm sure if you're watching this video, you've had some sort of interaction with some sort of inappropriate behaviors, either, in your day-to-day, your kiddos have inappropriate behaviors, something like that. But really it is looking at how can we decrease these behaviors? Because obviously they're having some sort of effect on our day-to-day lives. And we definitely want to address them and try to move forward with how we can reduce them over time. So that kind of encompasses that B of the ABC part of it. And now we're going to talk about C, and this is consequence. And I think that this is where, just in working in the field of special education for as long as I have, there are a lot of misconceptions about what a consequence is, because when a kiddo is having an inappropriate behavior, a lot of times people are like, they're receiving a consequence, which is usually discipline. In our behavior land or behavior world, we use consequence in a different way. And so I really want to make sure that it's clear to you what consequence means from a behavior perspective. Consequence is something that happens, an event or thing that directly follows the behavior. So just like I talked about in the antecedent piece of it, the antecedent happens directly before, the consequence happens directly after. And I think the really important part is that if the consequence matches what the antecedent is, then that confirms the three-term contingency. And what I mean by that is, if a direction is given as the antecedent. A student rips up the piece of paper, and now the consequence is that he no longer has to complete that said piece of paper. We have now, what we talked about, reinforced that behavior, and it's more likely to occur in the future, the ripping up of the behavior. And we'll get into a little bit more of reinforcement versus punishment, because that is considered the consequence in behavior, in the world of behavior. But really, anything can be a consequence. You receive a high five for finishing that math problem. Like I said, the reading activity stops, a child is told to stop. All of these different things can be a consequence. And the interesting part, and it could get very confusing, is that the consequence can actually become the antecedent for the next behavior that occurs. And it's kind of this unfortunate vicious cycle of what can happen when inappropriate behaviors are happening. I don't want to make you guys too confused on that, but I just wanted to kind of throw that in there, that the consequence can become the antecedent. So like I said, child is told to stop. That was the consequence, but it can now become the antecedent for the next behavior that could be occurring. And the biggest piece of it is that why it's considered a consequence in behavior land is that it can either increase or maintain the behavior, which we'll call reinforcement, or it can decrease the behavior, which we'll call punishment. It can't do both at the same time. So it can't increase or maintain the behavior or decrease the behavior at the same time. And the reason being is that we want to look at what is the specific behavior that we're trying to either increase or decrease. And that's what we're going to target in our interventions. And so if you've ever had a behavior plan, a lot of times there are, if it's a positive behavior plan, we're going to look at what are the skills that we want to reinforce, the more appropriate behaviors, and get the kid to discriminate between, I'm not going to use this inappropriate behavior anymore, and I'm going to use this procedure to try to decrease it. Okay? So let's talk a little bit more about the types of consequences. I know I've kind of gone into it around reinforcement and punishment, but let's talk a little bit about it in more detail. Reinforcement is a consequence that maintains or increases behavior over time. When I say maintains, it means that that behavior is likely to happen at the same frequency or level in the future. Now, I get told a lot of times that, oh, I tried a token board and it didn't work. Well, I'm going to be honest with you. If it doesn't work, then it's not really reinforcement, because reinforcement is supposed to increase the behavior or at least maintain whatever the behavior is that you're currently working on. So if you're actually seeing a decrease in behavior, or you're seeing something that is not changing at all, that could be that your consequence could actually be punishment. And this is where it gets a little confusing for people outside of the behavior world, but I definitely will try to explain that a little bit more. When we're looking at writing a behavior plan and using reinforcement, we tend to put a high level of reinforcement in there. And the reason that we do that is we want to make sure that when you're teaching a new skill, we use it as what's called a fixed ratio of 1 schedule of reinforcement. And really what that means is every time that kiddo does that behavior that we want them to do, every time they sit down in their seat and they're sitting, they get something. Whether it's a token, it's a high five, social praise, it's an edible like a M&M or something like that. They are getting that every single time so that we can increase their chances of doing that in the future. Really, reinforcement over time, you need to see whatever behavior you're trying to increase or maintain, that it stays at that level or increases over time. If it's not doing that, then it's not considered reinforcement. Now, this is where it's going to get so crazy, and I have had many discussions with people in my personal life about the difference between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, and I'll try to break it down for you. Positive reinforcement doesn't mean that it's good versus bad, positive versus negative as bad. Positive just means that something is being added to whatever you're doing. So you're adding that token. You're giving that extra piece of it instead of them just doing it for themselves. That's something added to it. Negative reinforcement is that something is removed. And the best way to try to think about this is that you're trying to avoid or escape something that you don't like. And so let's say you have an interaction with a coworker that you do not like at all. You're going to probably try to get away as quickly as possible. If you're able to get away or walk away within 5 minutes of that conversation, if that person allowed that to happen and didn't follow you, you're now using negative reinforcement because you're more likely in the future to walk away from that person within that 5 minutes because they reinforced your behavior. Another example that's kind of just an example within our community is that when it's raining, you don't want your head to get wet, or most people don't want to get wet. Putting the umbrella up and removing that rain, the use of an umbrella is actually going to take away that adversive stimulus, right? That adversive piece of the rain hitting you. And so in the future, you're more likely to use that umbrella than if you didn't use it. And so it's negatively reinforcing your behavior because it has taken away that rain, which is that adversive something that you don't like. Okay. If you have any more questions, like I said, please comment in the chat. I'm more than happy to answer or have a more specific conversation with you. Now, when we're looking at punishment in our behavior analysis world, we want to make sure that we're using punishment as a last resort. It really should be something that is utilized only when you've tried all of the reinforcement things and they aren't working. You're not seeing a change in the behavior or the more appropriate behaviors. So punishment is really just a consequence that helps to decrease behaviors over time. And again, positive versus negative. Positive punishment is just something is added. Negative punishment is something is removed. And so I don't want to go into too much about that, but just knowing that the difference is not, again, plus versus minus or good versus bad when we're saying positive versus negative. It's just that something is added or something is removed. So this is a very common term that's used in extinction. And extinction is really the withdrawal of reinforcement of that behavior that was previously reinforced. And it must be the same function. So extinction of an intention-seeking behavior. Let's say the kiddo is constantly hitting you to get the attention. In order to use extinction correctly, every time that child hits you to get attention, you are not going to provide the attention. You're only going to provide the attention if the student says, "Excuse me," your name, raises their hand, some other form of an appropriate way to get access to your attention, and then you're going to give them that attention if they do it the right way. So really with extinction, you're looking at helping the student to discriminate between what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And you're only reinforcing and providing that piece of reinforcement when they're doing it the right way. Now, this has to be done each and every time that the behavior occurs. And this is where it is so hard for families, teachers, because if you don't do it, I like to think of it this way. It's like a slot machine. If the kiddo is hitting you, doesn't get access to it the first time, gets access the next 2 times, doesn't get it the next time, gets access to it the next time, not the next 2 times, he or she doesn't know when they're going to be able to access that reinforcement. Just like a slot machine, you keep playing because you don't know when you're going to win. And they're going to continue to engage in the hitting behavior. And that is why I am a big believer is if you want to put a specific behavior on extinction, you better be able to do it every single time, or it's going to be harder to decrease. It's going to be harder to actually get rid of that behavior. And so if that's not something that you can do, there are other interventions that we can put in place to try to help decrease that behavior over time. But I want you guys to think about that, is that if you're not able to follow through with whatever it is every single time, then we need to put some other intervention in place. Another good example is, let's say the Kiddo wants you to put on the shoes for them instead of them tying their own shoes, putting their shoes on and tying it. If you do it one time because you're rushing out the door and need to get out the door, now the kiddo doesn't know when they're going to have to do it themselves versus when you're going to do it for them. And now they're more likely to continue to pester you to get you to do it versus them doing it. So if it's those things that you have to think about in regards to, is this a time when I will be able to, in essence, follow through with the demand is what we call. So make sure that you're able to do it every single time. And if you're not, that's okay. I understand. Life is hard. Sometimes you're on a time crunch and I get it, but we need to make sure that we put a different intervention in place rather than extinction. So now let's talk about how do we define our behaviors that we're looking at when we're talking about inappropriate behavior and what does it look like? So operational definitions are a detailed description of the inappropriate behavior and as detailed as you can be so that if myself or somebody else is observing the same behavior, we are able to track and record the same things. And that's how it allows multiple people to observe and record the same responses. And that's what we're going to talk about when we get into like frequency and duration moving forward. But really helping to understand what the actual behavior is that you're observing or that you want to decrease is going to really help be able to have other people see it and know, oh, I need to intervene because this is the behavior that we are looking at. It can also include attempts. So let's say if a kiddo, raises their fist towards you, but doesn't actually make contact with you, you could still include that under your operational definition of aggression if that's something that happens quite frequently and it's something that you want to decrease over time as well too. And then finally, it allows for what we call different forms of responses, or we say in the behavior world, topography of the behavior. But really, that's just looking at the different types of or forms of responses that could be included under that umbrella term. So if we're going to label that umbrella term like aggression, this is how we could say it: hitting with an open or closed fist, scratching that leaves a red mark on the skin, kicking, biting that leaves teeth marks or breaks the skin. You can go that in depth around what you're looking at. And maybe it's not that the kiddo bites and leaves teeth marks or breaks the skin, but just puts their mouth to your hand. You could label it that way as well too. It's so that everybody is able to understand what this looks like and how they can track it. So here's another example of self-injurious behavior is defined as any attempt to engage or actually engaging in one or more of the following: hitting head with open palm or closed fist, hitting head on ground or other hard surface, and or biting arm hard enough to leave teeth marks. So really, that's helpful. I know that now he will hit his head with his own hands, either open palm or closed fist. They'll hit their head on the ground or another hard surface, like maybe a table, and that they'll bite their arm. But if they do anything outside of that, let's say they begin to start picking at their skin to cause themselves to bleed, that wasn't initially included under this, and it might be something that we need to, is it part of self-injurious behavior or is it a separate behavior? So that's really why defining the behaviors that you're looking at, the inappropriate behaviors, is really, really important because it allows you to get information about what those behaviors are. And then if you're looking at what are the functions of those behaviors, then you're able to really, okay, these behaviors are this function, whereas maybe the picking is for a different function. So it helps you to really kind of pull out all of the different types of behaviors and really look at the functions of what those behaviors are. So another part of operational definitions is that it can also include what we call the onset or the offset of the behavior. The onset, as an example, when the child has engaged in one or more of the listed behaviors. He has hit his head. He has started biting. Any of those is that onset of it. The offset is when, and you can do this whatever works best for the child or the person, when the child has not engaged in one or more of the listed behaviors for at least a minute. So it kind of depends on the kid for the offset of how you want to do it. Sometimes it's that the kid needs more time than that. And it really depends on when we're talking about episodes of the behavior happening. We want to look at, does it look, or does the student stop the engagement of these behaviors before engaging again? And what's that time duration between those episodes happening? And I really want to make sure that um, if I'm seeing that, they bite and then they stop for a second and then they bite again, is that considered two separate instances or is it all considered one? And that's where you kind of have to really look at it in detail and figure out what is going to be best to help operationally define that behavior. The other piece of it is that it can include intensity or severity. So like low intensity, no mark on the skin. That means it was low intensity. Medium intensity, it left a red mark on the skin. So we know that it's moving up and it's becoming a little bit more intense or severe. And then high intensity, you've now broken the skin and it's bleeding. So it helps if that, for some people to know that if we're constantly seeing high intensity behaviors, that we need to definitely look at, okay, is the interventions that we have in place, are they appropriate? Because we're continuing to see this high level of breaking of the skin, bleeding, and nothing has changed over the past 2 weeks. We might need to look at our interventions and come in and change them. Additionally, it can also include examples or non-examples. And what I mean by that is examples of what, let's say, non-compliance could look like. So an example of non-compliance could be saying no, turning body away from staff after a direction is given, and dropping to the floor. But non-examples could be wiggling in seat after a direction is given, putting head down on the table, but continuing to work. So giving those examples and non-examples really help for the observer, whoever that may be, to really know, okay, what is included under these inappropriate behaviors. And even though what I just listed as non-examples could be considered under non-compliance, for that kiddo, that is not part of his or her operational definition. And so it is not considered part of that inappropriate behavior. And it's not something we're looking to decrease over time. So some ABCs. We're going to just talk about just an example. Sammy walks into the class and sits down at his desk. His teacher tells him to take out his lunch. Sammy says, no, his teacher walks away. So in this situation, his teacher telling him to take out his lunch is the antecedent. That's the direction that was given. And the reason that I put in Sammy walks into class and sits down at his desk is because I want you guys to know that there are also things that are happening prior to the antecedent as well that could play a role. But really the antecedent is his teacher asks him to take out his lunch. The behavior is Sammy says no. And the consequence is his teacher walks away. In that situation, he was negatively reinforced by saying no because his teacher asked him to gave him a direction of what he was supposed to do. And when he said no, the teacher didn't follow through and walked away. Okay, so that's a good example of negative reinforcement. Diane is sitting at her desk when another student walks by and hits her head with an open palm on the back of her head. Diane begins crying and puts her head down on the desk. Her teacher tells her that she can go for a walk to calm down. So I purposely did this because it's a little bit of a trick. We're looking at two different students, correct? Diane and another student. In this situation, I am looking specifically for what is Diane's behavior. Diane's behavior in this is not that she's sitting at her desk, but that she begins crying and puts her head down on her desk. The antecedent in this situation is that another student walks by and hits her on the back of the head. That's the antecedent. The consequence is that the teacher tells her she can go for a walk to calm down. So, looking at this, obviously this is one data point. I don't know if in this situation, it is reinforcement, trying to get out of what's going on because she got hit in the back of the head. A negative reinforcement. I would have to see Diane more often to look at why is her crying and putting her head down. Obviously, yes, she got hit on the back of the head. That would probably make anyone upset. And we're really looking at, does this crying behavior only happen when something like that happens, or is it happening throughout the day? In this situation, she is upset because she got hit on the back of the head, and she's able to use what we would call a coping strategy to go try to calm herself down. So she is able, in essence, to really get away from that other student. So it could be considered as negative reinforcement because she engaged in this crying behavior and put her head down on the desk, and the teacher allowed her to walk away from that student or not be around that student. So it could be considered negative reinforcement. So I know I use these terms a little bit throughout this presentation so far, but really looking at frequency, duration, and latency. Frequency is how many times did the behavior occur? Can you count it? You really want to be able to tally that, okay? And there's another piece of it really that goes into what we call rate, which is frequency plus when it's like how long it's happening for. So sometimes you'll see that the rate of the behavior is 4 times per day. Now, the frequency is the 4 times, and adding the per day gives a more in-depth information around how often it's occurring in a particular time frame, and that's why it's called the rate versus the frequency. But frequency is really, can you tally it? Can you tell me how much it's happening? So in both of those situations, each of those behaviors that we just saw only happened once. But throughout the day, maybe they're happening more often. Maybe Sammy is saying no on average 40 times per day. So that's what we want, or maybe 40 times per hour. We want to make sure that we're looking at how often it's occurring throughout the day. The duration is how long did it last? So obviously saying no is going to be pretty quick, but if that's part of his non-compliance and it goes into other behaviors, like let's say he says no and drops to the floor and then refuses to engage in any other assignment, then you would start taking what we call duration, which is looking at, okay, it started when he said no. How long is this behavior lasting until we can get him back on task and being able to move forward with his day? So sometimes it could be less than a minute. Sometimes it can be 30 minutes, 60 minutes. And that's really when you're looking at that onset and that offset as well. So when does it start and when does it end? And I think that's really important because sometimes, I will be honest, if a behavior is occurring that's happening at a high frequency or a high rate, then duration data is what I have taken in the past. So looking at, okay, it started at 9:05 and it went until 11:25. We know that that's how long the behavior lasted for. And it was really hard to take accurate frequency in the middle of that behavior occurring because it was happening so often, and so many different types or topographies of behavior or forms of behavior were happening. Let's say property destruction, aggression, and tantrum behavior were all happening within that duration of time. Then we really can look at it as like, okay, what behaviors did occur during that time and how long was it? And really start to work on reducing the duration of time so that we can then start working on the frequency of how often it's happening. And then finally, latency is how long does it take the student to engage in a behavior after a direction is given. So it's the time from when something else happens, the antecedent, to when that person or student is engaging in what they're supposed to be doing. So it might be that I tell Sammy to take out his lunchbox, and instead of saying no, it takes him 5 minutes to take out his lunchbox. So he's still engaging in whatever the direction was that I gave him, but it's taking him a long time to initiate that task. We're going to also want to look at probably over time reducing his latency to that direction given so that we can get him to move through his day a little bit quicker. So now let's talk about functions of behavior, because I know that that term is often thrown around in the field of special education as well too. We want to find the functions or the why of these behaviors happening. So in behavior world, there are 4 different functions. Access to tangibles. Tangibles can be food, preferred items, your favorite toy, anything like that. You want to gain access to that. So you're engaging in some sort of behavior in order to access that. An appropriate way would be, can I have my iPad, please? We're using our functional communication. An inappropriate way is I hit you because you're holding my iPad and I get access to my iPad. Access to attention. This one is very common. Unfortunately, especially since COVID, I think that kids don't know how to maybe interact as well as they used to or need more training in being able to socialize. But they want to get access from peers or from adults or just anyone in their environment. And so, like I said, maybe they're hitting you to get the attention versus saying, excuse me. Escaping from aversive stimuli. Like I said, this can be your demands placed. So you are not wanting to get that work done. You're ripping up the piece of paper and not having to do the work. Or your environmental events, and that's kind of that umbrella scenario, but it also can be an aversive stimuli of another person. So let's say I am having a really heated discussion with somebody and I'm not liking how the conversation is going. If I just, without even saying anything, just get up and leave and walk away, that is me trying to escape from the aversive stimuli. And so I had a question. Can you ever get back years of no socialization? I think that's a really good question. Sorry. So I think that there definitely is a way that you can get back to helping students understand how to appropriately socialize. I definitely think with the COVID years happening and our limited access to people in person has greatly affected our ability to understand, nonverbal communication and just kind of the basic social cues. But I do think that it is helpful to teach kiddos that. Even adults still sometimes need it. And so there are ways that you can teach those skills to help them to be able to better socially, to have better social interactions. I think that we're starting from more of a deficit, which definitely plays a bigger role in how long it would take for the kiddos or people to gain access to those skills, and might require a long or high level of reinforcement in order to do so. Because I think that it kind of goes back to that escape from aversive stimuli. A lot of kiddos who maybe were, very young during those COVID years and were only interacting with their family now are scared to go out into public or to interact with other people in the community or to go to school. And so we really have to help them learn the appropriate way to transition away from their family and that it is okay to be out in the community and to be safe. And that could take high levels of reinforcement. So that was definitely a great question. Thank you for that. For automatic reinforcement, which is also known as sensory, but in behavior world, we like to use our own terminology for automatic reinforcement. Really what that means is it just doesn't include another person. It's not social. So all of the other three have access to another person, an environmental event that's affecting them. But automatic reinforcement can either be to gain access to pleasure. So I really, like clicking a pen. It helps me to be able to calm myself down in that moment. No one else is around. I'm just clicking my pen. That's automatically reinforcing that I'm going to do it in the future. And another way to think about it is definitely sexual relations with yourself is automatically reinforcing to gain access to pleasure. And then definitely the other piece of it for the automatic is to attenuate pain. And what that means is if you've ever had like a headache and you've squeezed your head or you've massaged your head, you're automatically reinforcing if that helped your headache to continue to do it in the future. So you're more likely to engage in those behaviors of pushing on your head or massaging your head when you have a headache because it got rid of that pain. Okay, so our behavior influences their behavior. So what I mean by that is, excuse me, I can be considered an environmental event in your child or your life. You could be considered an environmental event in my life as well. So, how you respond to my behavior can influence my behavior, right? Because I'm an environmental event, and that's what we're looking at. We're looking at how do those two things work together, and how are we able to, in essence, manipulate what that looks like in order to change what we want our behavior to look like. So how we respond to inappropriate behaviors affect whether the behavior continues or de-escalates. And I think that this is really important. Things to think about, your tone of voice. I am a big believer in using different types of tone of voice. And what I mean by that is when I am providing a direction, if a kiddo or a person is having an inappropriate behavior, I tend to use a very neutral voice, or sometimes even maybe a stern voice to get them to comply. Um, but when they do, in comply with that direction or anything. I'm using like I like to call it my Disneyland voice, but I'm using a more animated voice to be like, yes, you did it. Awesome. Good job. So they understand the difference between it's time to sit down and, oh my gosh, you just sat down. I'm so proud of you. Good job. Right. So having that distinction between your tone of voice can really help the student to discriminate when they need to follow through with a direction and when they've actually done it and they're getting that reinforcement. Body language and facial expressions can play a huge role. Um, I am terrible with my body and facial expressions. You can definitely read me like a book, but it's about working on those. Keeping that neutral face expression, trying not to laugh when something's happening. If a kiddo is doing something funny as an inappropriate behavior, your body language, crossing your arms to kids, especially if they're already frustrated, can come off as being um, kind of rude or something like that, and they that can sometimes escalate them. I apologize. So making sure that your body language when you're talking to some, when you're trying to talk to them, uh, standing directly in front of them when they're upset, that body language of just having your body directly in front of them could be taken in many different ways that you're there to potentially fight. Whereas like standing kind of more to the side can help them. So proximity and body language and facial expressions can play a big role in de-escalating the situation. I also think that I use the term Q-tip, quit taking it personally. These kiddos are not their behaviors, or whoever you're working with, or even if it's adults, their behavior is not who they are as a person. It is some form of their way of trying to release what is going on inside of them. And so really thinking about starting fresh the next day, if you had a really rough day with a kiddo the day before, or maybe it's a coworker that you got into a fight with the day before. Really trying to start fresh and not take it personally. And I know that that is so hard not to do. It's still something that I have to continue to work on, but it really does help to kind of rebuild that relationship and reestablish that rapport with that kiddo, and able to move forward with de-escalating or continuing to decrease those behavior. And then I think finally, one of the things that and again, it's still a work in progress for myself as well, is a self-control plan. Knowing what your triggers are. So one of my kids found out that I absolutely hated clowns, and every time he would get into a behavior, he would talk about clowns, try to find them anywhere he could, have a little clown in his pocket so that he knew that it would trick me into trying to respond in a different way. So I really had to come up with a different self-control plan on that one. But knowing that like if certain words or language is used, that maybe it's time for you to switch out with a different person, or for you to tag your partner in. It could be, them breaking stuff in your house. That could be a very big trigger for you. So I want you to know what your triggers are and then have a plan of what to do. Is it that I'm going to take a step back and take a couple deep breaths? Is it that I'm going to ask to tag out with my partner if it's, me and my husband or whoever it may be? Really just knowing what that looks like, and having a good plan, and then what to do if you're unable to use that self-control plan at that moment. So let's say your partner isn't home and it's just you with the kiddo. What are you going to do in that situation? So let's talk about some strategies that you can use. I know you guys have probably heard about this a lot, but using first then. First this, then you get access to this. It can be done as a verbal, it can be done with a visual. It can even be like a sequence of events. It doesn't have to just be first then. It could be first, next, last. Whatever works for you and what is best for your student or child or whoever. It really, excuse me, helps to provide the student with knowing what my expectations are and what I get when I am done with those expectations. And then over time, you can definitely fade out what that reinforcement looks like afterwards. Providing choices. And I mean providing choices into do you want to sit or stand while you do this? Do you want to make your bed first or eat your breakfast first? Providing them with choices of what they feel is best. It gives them a sense of power or control, and provides that autonomy that even though we're setting kind of those expectations or those limitations, they're able to still have some control over what they're doing throughout the day. Setting the deal. I'm going to talk about this because I hear this all the time. The difference between reinforcement and bribery. And I believe setting the deal is the big piece of it. So in bribery, the kiddo has already engaged in that behavior, and now you're using something to get them to stop that behavior. They are crying in the middle of the grocery store, and you're like, hey, if you get up and you do this, you get a cookie. And the kiddo gets up and does that. That's bribery, not reinforcement. Reinforcement is prior to going into the grocery store, you know your kiddo's going to want a cookie. Hey, Sammy, if you go into the grocery store, we get everything done. You can pick out your cookie. And then at the end, as long as you've had appropriate behavior, you get your cookie on the car ride home. That's setting the deal. That's reinforcement. So there's a difference, right? I've already explained to him and front loaded to him what he needs to do in order to access the cookie versus, oh no, he's already in a behavior and I have to get him out of this because I'm embarrassed that he's crying in the middle of the grocery store. I'm just going to give him a cookie now. So we really want to make sure that with whatever we're doing, we're setting that deal. We are making sure that the kid is, or the person is aware and understanding of what the expectation is in order to get said item. High probability request sequence. This is a fun way of just saying we try to get them to use behavioral momentum, or in other words, previously mastered tasks that they have. What's your name? High five. Turn around, all things that they have previously mastered. And then you put the tough thing that you're asking them to do, say transition to the next activity, at the end of it. And it needs to be quick, right? Hey, Sally, high five. What's your name? Sally. Turn around. Okay, now it's time to go to circle. And there's a lot of research and evidence that shows that if you're getting them to already comply, they're more likely to comply with whatever that one is that they don't like to do. So it's really about making sure that you're getting them and you're reinforcing them as they're complying with those other pieces of it, and getting them to feel that reinforcement, feel that not from a behavioral standpoint, but that internal feeling that they've done something well, so that they're more likely to want to continue that trajectory. Transition warnings. I like to kind of sparse them out into timed-based or activity-based. And what I mean by that is a timed-based transition warning is, hey, you have 5 more minutes until we're going to the grocery store. Activity-based is, hey, you can finish that coloring sheet. And then once you're done with that coloring sheet, we're going to move to the next activity. So timed is giving them a specific duration of time that you're asking them to do, versus activity-based is they're actually able to complete that activity. And the reason that I kind of sparse these out is I've seen kiddos struggle and have inappropriate behaviors with one or the other or both at the same time. Um, Getting those transition warnings sometimes can cause anxiety for kiddos. And so I want them to be, if that's what's happening, then maybe it's that they get to finish whatever the activity is first before even knowing what their time is. Obviously, if it's going to take them 25 minutes and you need to move to the next activity, maybe it's that, okay, we don't get to finish the activity. I want you to finish coloring the wings, and then we'll come back to this in the future after we finish X. So it really helps to know which transition or both, if they're both happening, that are causing those inappropriate behaviors, to allow for the appropriate interventions to be in place. Breaking assignments into parts or tasks into parts. So if the expectation is to clean your room and there is so much things that they need to do, they need to put away all of their clothes, they need to make their bed, they need to put their toys away, they need like all of these different steps to it. Have them do one thing at a time. Hey, just go put your toys away first, then we'll take a break and we'll have some lunch. Then after lunch, we're going to finish and make your bed. Right. So breaking it into smaller increments is helpful and allows them to be more successful, excuse me, and actually completing whatever the task is, because they know that there is access to some sort of reinforcement. And obviously over time, you want them to be able to do the entire thing, cleaning their room in one big false swoop. But if that's, you have to work up to that, and you have to slowly shape their behavior in order to get to that. More time, allowing them to have more time, allowing them to request for more time, and honoring that. I think that's really, really important. If they're saying like, I'm not done yet, I need some more time. If just giving them a couple of extra minutes to complete it allows them to complete the task without having inappropriate behaviors, it's definitely awesome. Now, I also think that I've ran into where kids will continue to request for more time over and over and over and over again. Now you have to set limitations. I've used visuals where I have 2 more time icons. They know that they get, more time twice. And once those icons are gone, more time is not available anymore. We need to move to the next activity, but we can have more time once we earn it back. So we really want to look at, not allowing the kiddos to kind of run the show if they're consistently requesting for more time, and putting in some limitations on that. Behavior contracts are things that you can utilize where it can be done for the day, excuse me, the day, it can be done for the week. And it's that if they do specific things that are written in there, they get that reinforcement at the end of the week. And I think that I only really use behavior contracts with older students who have a lot more, I will say, verbal communication and are able to understand what this contract is about. And I will use it if they're able to delay that gratification, because I think that a lot of times when I'm looking at trying to decrease inappropriate behaviors, if we don't have the right level of reinforcement, or the schedule, what we'd say the schedule of reinforcement, so how often they're getting that reinforcement, we might not see the inappropriate behaviors decrease. And so if a kiddo isn't able to delay their gratification for the whole day for that behavior contract, a behavior contract might not be appropriate. Positively phrased statements. And I think that this is really something that I have had to work on and master, just being in my line of work for as long as I have. Instead of saying don't run, tell the kid what you want them to do. Just telling them no or that's not available also can be triggering statements for students. And I'm not saying don't use no or not available, but making it so that they understand what their expectation is. So this isn't available right now. It will be available at this time. I need you to use walking feet in the hallway. I need you to keep your feet on the ground versus saying, stop jumping on the bed. Those types of things, just switching that and really providing them with the expectation of what you want them to do versus just saying no, actually can really help with with them following through with that expectation. Using statements instead of questions for directions. So I learned this the hard way, unfortunately, when I was early in my career. And I said, hey, do you want to do X? And the kid was like, no. And I was like, darn it. Well, now he said, no, I can't. Like, how do I follow through with it? So really using those statements instead of questions. So I need you to do X. And really keeping them simple. I need you to sit in the seat. I need you to sit in the chair. Those types of things can really help to avoid them saying no. Can they still say no to the statement? Yes, but you can definitely still follow through more with when instead of asking them that question. Using visuals. A lot of times, and I will tell you from just my own personal experience, when I am upset, I think my ability to understand language and process language becomes a challenge. And so use the use of visuals, especially with our kiddos during those times, even if they do have a lot of vocal communication when they are not in inappropriate behavior, can help support and supplement our ability to provide expectations and directions. Using the first then chart, like I talked about, or visuals of what the expectation is. If they're to sit instead of saying sit, sometimes just seeing the sit will allow them to not require uh, that level of um, uh, the verbal communication and can actually de-escalate the situation. Use of timers. Sometimes timers can be beneficial or not beneficial. It depends on the student, but definitely having visual timers or timers knowing how long that they have. Like I said, if something's unavailable, try to provide two alternatives of stuff that is available. So if like the iPad is not currently available, what is available? Oh, Legos and a book. Choose between one of those two things. So providing those alternatives really helps to over time decrease the inappropriate behaviors when they're occurring. Breaks, allowing students to have breaks, even, if they're doing something at home or I know I take breaks throughout the day. It helps me to just kind of recompose and get back into what I need to do and become more efficient in what I'm working at. And then something that's called non-contingent attention or breaks. Non-contingent attention or non-contingent breaks means that they don't have to earn either of those. They're just getting attention throughout the day. They're getting breaks already built into their schedule. Those are really helpful in just allowing them to get access to maybe what that function may be without having to actually request it. And that was the end of my presentation. I really appreciate you guys being here and listening. I know I went over by a couple of minutes, but I really wanted to be going into as much depth and detail as possible. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My phone number and my email is listed above. And I would love to have, more in-depth conversations or to help support in any way that I can. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a blessed day.